Alrighty, everybody, this is the second part of Chapter 8. We're going to again be talking about physical activity, but more specifically about opportunities outside of school, with greater attention to the use of pedometers and active walking. So we'll dive into that a little bit. It's a pretty brief lecture, so if you do have more questions, please email me or talk to me in class. I'm happy to answer any questions you have, and again, my office hours are following class, so if you need any catching up, I'm happy to help you out there. This has been a little bit finicky, the recording, so I'm going to do my best to streamline this and make it really, really efficient. So the first thing I want to point out is what we've discussed in previous class lectures. So we discussed this idea that 60 minutes of physical activity, moderate to vigorous physical activity, is what is recommended for children. And do remember that we talked about the fact that this does not have to be one extensive 60-minute bout of physical activity, but rather it's better for children to have shorter periods of physical activity with greater breaks. So PE and maybe structuring your physical activity that way, so to ensure that children get 60 minutes per day. And just a reminder that adults, it's a 30-minute recommendation, so half of what children are expected to get. In class, we talked about the physical activity pyramid, but I didn't provide you with an actual photo of it, and I had you pull it up in class. So if you were not in class, make sure you use the old Google machine and look up the physical activity pyramid and examine why we use it and how we might use it with children. It basically tells us what types of physical activities we can do, how much, and just basically general expectations for physical activity participation. And just think about creative ways you might be able to use that when teaching young children. And the last thing we really touched on, larger area that we touched on, was this idea of how to structure a playground so that it promotes physical activity or encourages greater amounts of physical activity. And we did talk about how a lot of the physical structure you can't really change. There's not like you have the power to uproot the things that are already in existence. But there are things that you can do to change the dynamic of the play that exists in a playground setting. And one of the things, for example, that we talked about was the use of color coding certain areas for certain types of play. So do visit the lecture from last class to see other ideas that we generated and discussed. And if you need more information on that, again, you can reach out to me or your classmates on that matter. So what we're talking about today, like I mentioned already, is we're briefly touching on the use of pedometers and how to incorporate that in your classrooms or when working with children. We're talking about walking, which is something that we're all pretty familiar with. And then we're going to talk about how we can apply the use of pedometers and incorporate different fun walking activities into our classrooms. So pedometers, really quickly, I think we all probably have some experience with pedometers. In fact, your phone has a pedometer in it. But there are plenty of apps, and there's plenty of actual different types of pedometers that exist. But what we found through research is that pedometers are valid and reliable in recording physical activity. So a lot of the research that you're reading, especially those of you who are doing newsletter briefs on physical activity, check the articles to see if they actually use pedometers or accelerometers or something of that nature. But pedometers measure a step count, and they're valid and reliable. And if you're familiar with those terms, then that's great. If you're not, I'll give you a quick breakdown of what valid and reliable means. So if something is valid, if a measure is valid, then it's actually measuring what it is supposed to measure. If it's reliable, it's consistent in its measurement. Okay, so something can be reliable, but it cannot be valid. And here's an example. If I were to step on the scale and the scale told me that I weighed 300 pounds, that is not an accurate representation of my weight. And so let's say I step on the scale the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and so on, and it tells me every single day that I'm 300 pounds. That scale is reliable, but it's not valid. So in the case of pedometers, it's both. So it measures what it's supposed to. It measures step count, and it's pretty consistent in how it measures. The one thing I will say about that is that there's many factors that contribute to making it valid and reliable, and there's different types of pedometers that have shown to be more valid and reliable in recording physical activity, or rather step count. So again, when used correctly, that's when we're going to get the accurate representation of our actual step count. And so there's two places where you typically wear pedometers, and those are both on the waistline, and one is directly above your kneecap, so right in the front part of your waistline, and then the other one is on the side of your hip. So those are the two most common places. There's actually research in this department going on that looks at the reliability and validity of pedometers in the pedometer use in pregnant women, and they have these pregnant women wear pedometers in multiple areas of their body: their ankles, their wrists, their waist, their hip, and they test the validity and reliability. So it's some cool stuff happening in your own building here. And then one of the things especially when working with children in the use of pedometers, in terms of location, you really want to go with what's most comfortable to the individual wearing the pedometer, and what is going to keep them from touching it. So again, one of the spots directly above the knee, in line with your thigh and your kneecap on your waistline, is probably one of the better spots. You want it to be straight. You don't want it to be angled. And when you're using it, you do want to be, if you're going to test to make sure it's actually recording, you can do like little short bouts of walking. So walk at a normal pace and count your own steps in your head, and then see if your pedometer is recording what the actual number of steps that you took. And then again, you're gonna do that again so that you can see if it's consistently measuring what it says it's measuring. And then the last bullet point saying, wear it underneath your belly button. That's just to prove the point that it's not really going to register very much underneath your belly button, because that part of your body doesn't move. It's a really stable part. Your core is a really stable part of your body as you're moving or you're walking. So it wouldn't be a good spot to wear your pedometer. But if you do have one, give it a shot and report back to me and let me know. So you can use pedometers in a class setting, and there's a bunch of different ways that you can get them. And again, this is one of those things where you're going to have to put in the effort, and you're going to have to potentially, recruit some people to give you money or do some funding opportunities to get them. But definitely a thing to consider, and it's really fun, and we'll talk about that more in a second. But there's ways around it, and if it is something that interests you, do a little bit of research and find ways that you can obtain pedometers. And there's shareware programs, so if you look into that a bit, it gives you reduced costs of these items because they believe it really does promote physical activity in children. So look into that a bit. And when you introduce pedometers to your students, it's really awesome because it's a way to track their physical activity, which is likely something that they haven't done before. So they're going to be really, really excited. And we know that can get out of hand fairly quickly. So you want to be careful with how you introduce it. Do it slowly with smaller activities, okay? So that they can get familiar with them. And as they're less and less excited about it and they become a much more normal thing, but still exciting, you want to implement them into longer extended periods of time and active periods. And then a lot of the time, pedometer use is encouraged among family members. And so you can encourage your students to wear them all day at school if it's something that makes sense at your school and they're responsible with their pedometers. Take them home and have their parents use them and see who's more physically active. They can be pretty fun. So it's a pretty exciting way to get people to be physically active. So this idea of handling pedometers is something that is very familiar to those of us who do research in this department. So this department, the kinesiology department at Michigan State University, has a pediatric focus. And what we mean by that is that a lot of the research that we do focuses on youth, so young kids. And so there's a whole lab here in this building that does physical activity research in youth populations. And so you would imagine that they use pedometers all the time, pedometers and accelerometers. And as you would also imagine that with pedometer use, you lose them all the time. And so it can end up adding up a bit. So you just have to be mindful of that. So you have to find a way to be really, really organized in how you keep track of these pedometers. So you want to have procedures in place, of course. You want to have procedures in place for everything. Another idea is to have numbers on the pedometer and have a number correspond to a student. And this is kind of cool because then they start to feel ownership over their pedometer. And maybe they'll care more about the number count that's on there. There's a whole bunch of ideas on here, keeping track of them in a clear, evident area of the classroom, so that you know if anybody's messing with them. You can do beginning and end of the day, so kind of this bookend idea. You start with it, you end with it, and there's some protocol in between. And there's just a few rules that people have used, or those that have worked in this department before. This idea that if they shake it, you take it. So if they're shaking it, they're trying to up their count and it's not real. They're not really being active. They're just moving their arm up and down. So you have every right to take that away from them. If they remove it from their waist, if they're playing with it too much, as a teacher, you just take it away. You handle the situation and you remove it from their possession. But the one thing about that, if you are going to use punishment or remove privilege of the use of an item or a game or something like that, you always want to explain why you're doing it, because it's not going to reinforce anything if you're not explaining the why. And we've talked about that in this class before. Okay, so activities, some just general ideas that you might be able to do. So you want to encourage this idea of a challenge, and so you want to ask them a bunch of questions and make them think it's a bit competitive and make them think who's more active, and maybe they generate some of the questions on their own. And then you can actually have them do some math. So we did a lesson plan today that utilized math. And so you can do that with pedometers as well. So reinforcing, how far you're actually walking. Walk across America. There's other things like swim across America that you've probably heard, or hypothetical like bike across America or the real bike across America. But in the classroom setting, you can register how far they're going and how many steps it takes to get across America. But one of the things that I've done, I've taught a running class before, and I make them choose a hypothetical location that they want to run to, and we register the miles. And it's kind of fun to do that because then they feel a little bit, it feels more personal to them because they pick a spot that usually is pretty fond to them and maybe has some fun memory, and then they do everything they can to get there. So it's a motivational technique that might work. And then again, you want to encourage this idea of being highly active. So see if you can implement some games that discern between high activity and low activity and help your students understand what the difference is. And then the last thing is, again, going back to that idea of competitiveness and maybe branching it out to the whole school. Usually people aren't going to turn down the idea of promoting physical activity as long as it's cost effective and fun. So now we're moving into walking. I know this isn't the most thrilling content, and I know it's very straightforward, but it's just food for thought more than anything. So when we're talking about walking, you want to encourage this idea that it's just the process is really fun. So there's a lot of things that you can do. So you want your students to enjoy the act of walking and maybe where they're walking or the company that they're with. So experience the whole thing and experience it in a positive light. So that's kind of on you to point some of those things out. And walking is the basis behind this idea that exercise is medicine. And what we mean by exercise is medicine is that if we exercise, it acts in the same way that medicine would to prevent or minimize the effects of particular health risks or diseases or anything of that nature, and things that we've talked about before. And you can see a list here that is not exhaustive, but it's just a very preliminary list. But exercise is medicine. The one plug I'll say about that is that there's actually an exercise is medicine activity going on campus right out behind Sparty statue tomorrow, and I'll put up a flyer for that, and I would love if you all participated in that. We actually compete with U of M and Penn State, so go State, right? Okay, so the idea of walking and weight management, I think that this is a very well-known concept, that the more you walk, the more manageable your weight is, or the more you move, the more manageable your weight is. So it's again this play on like the intake and the expenditure. So expenditure is what you're basically burning when you're being physically active. And then a lot of people focus on diets, but we know that diets are fads, and sometimes they fade in and out, and they're not really we're not too resilient when we pursue diets. So it's harder to stick to a diet than it is to walk, or at least there's been evidence that shows that. And again, encouraging this idea that weight management is a lifestyle. It's not just a brief stint of, like a diet would be. Walking is also really good because it is not as taxing as some other activities, like, for example, running or playing particular sports. So most people who are physically or who are not physically disabled or struggling from any issues that prevent them from walking are able to walk. And so it's not there's not many negative side effects to walking, so it's encouraged highly. And then this is a funny one, trekking. I'm sure we can all imagine someone doing this, the overzealous hiker, right? This person that brings the two walking poles. But the one thing that we will say about using those is that they burn a lot more calories than actually walking without, because you have to do a little bit more work. And then hiking. Super fun, super easy way to encourage walking. I remember I went to 6th grade camp and we did hiking for like 3 days. And I remember someone saying, "This is just walking." And my instructor said, "Yep." And that was the end of the conversation. So recommendations for walking. And this one seems kind of funny, but you want to teach your students how to walk well. So every time you have your students move, it's an opportunity for you to reinforce proper movement or reinforce those motor skills. So you'll see that some people don't actually walk correctly, and if they don't ever get corrected on it, especially at a young age, then they're never going to appropriately learn how to walk. So do know that you can, encourage a certain style of walking, but also a certain style of walking that is a more active form. So not that little shuffle that we tend to do when we're really tired, right? So a brisk stride with purpose. This is a very typical way to consider how hard you should be working, but when you're walking, you should be able to carry on a conversation. It shouldn't be as easy as if you're just sitting, but you should be able to carry on the conversation without difficulty. So you shouldn't be taking big breaths in between things that you're saying. So easy conversation. You do want to increase the intensity or encourage increasing the intensity. And there's a number of ways that you can do that. So just always keep that kind of thing in mind. And we've talked about that with the lesson plans as well. Okay. So a lot of schools have school walking programs, and we did actually talk about this in class on Tuesday. And there's just a few things to remember when you do that. You do want to use things like maps and sidewalk direction, and making sure you use things like a sign-out sheet so you can track students and make sure they're wearing appropriate clothing, they're protected with sunscreen, and that they don't play too much with dogs. But all of these things to remember, are essentially safety checks in themselves. So we're suggesting all these things because we don't want kids to get lost. We don't want them to, have a tragic accident because they don't know how to use a sidewalk. We do want to know where our students are all the time, so sign in and sign out. We want to make sure that they're not too cold or they're too hot and they struggle in that sense. And again, and there's so many things that we need to consider, but these are some basic ones. So these are some suggestions for things that you can implement in your walks. So I've taught a power walking and a distance running class, and these are things that I've actually played in my class when teaching at a collegiate level, and I promise you they're fun all the time. You just have to modify it for your age group. So I Spy is always, it may seem like a young game, but if you modify it so that it's age appropriate, it can be really fun. And I think we're learning that in our class with the lesson plans that we've gone through today. So these are just some ideas, and I'll encourage you to think about some that that you might utilize in your teaching practices. But the main thing is that you want to make walks fun. You want to make it so that people don't view walking or moving in general as a boring thing. So that's kind of on you to promote this idea of fun and collaboration among your students, and maybe acknowledging the environment that they're in. There's a lot of things you can learn on walking, but you mostly want it to be a fun experience. So think of some things that you can do, note them down, and take them with you so that when you leave this class, you have some ideas. Another set of suggestions, you can, again, take these away. I'm not going to go through all of them, but it's just a way to make walking fun or make moving fun. I do a scavenger hunt all the time in all of my physical activity classes all around MSU's campus, and it's been a really cool experience. So there's plenty of things you can do. Consider all of those things and apply them to your classes if you ever have the chance in the future. Alrighty? So hopefully you've all enjoyed this second installment of Kat Does Online Lecturing. There will probably be more because it seems to be working well. So hopefully this one works out and y'all don't have too many questions, but again, I'm happy to field them if you do. I look forward to seeing y'all on Tuesday and seeing some more lesson plans. So have a great